Good evening. Welcome back to another exciting adventure of For the Glory of God and Kings. I am your host, Travis Finley, and we are going to continue our look in Genesis in the early chapters. We are looking at the prohibition of Adam from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When we looked at Genesis 1 and we looked primarily at the image of God, I encouraged you to consider the reality that the very text itself gives us information to understand what the text is saying. I think that the same thing is happening here in the account of the prohibition with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Again, this is one of the doctrines of the scriptures that I have changed my mind on since growing up. I remember not only in my church education through Sunday school or youth group, but also in college and seminary, I never heard what I'm going to explain to you as what I think the text is telling us. So for over 20 years, I never heard this explanation from the scriptures, and I think that it's a healthy way to look at the text. I will tell you one thing in contrast, that is, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is always looked at in the negative. It's a bad thing. It's a bad thing because when God said, in the day that you eat of it, you will die. So the result of it is negative, okay? So that is one aspect. It's a bad tree. If you participate in it, it leads to death. And then there's always there's also the term, it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So we talk about, well, what did Adam and Eve know and understand before they sinned? Well, they didn't know experientially evil. So to know evil then is a bad thing. But I'm going to challenge that, okay? I'm going to challenge that on two counts, if I'm correct in what I recall what I was going to do. It's either two, but we'll see what happens with that. So we see that God said, from any tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you must not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you will surely die. Okay? I want to jump down into the temptation now, because that's when the tree comes up again. Okay? Actually, let me do this. I'm going to jump to two other texts, and then we're going to come back here. Okay? So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I do not believe is a bad tree. It's not a bad tree. The designation knowledge of good and evil is not a bad thing. Okay? It is a good thing to know good and evil. Why? Because God knows good and evil. God is not evil. He knows good and evil. So therefore, knowledge of evil isn't bad. Okay? Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 39. The Israelites are anticipating going into the promised land after a 40-year wilderness wandering for their disobedience. Deuteronomy 1:39 says this: "Moreover, your little ones, who you said would become victims, and your sons, who this day have no knowledge of good and evil, shall enter there, and I will give it to them, and they shall possess it." Okay? So there we have two designations. Your little ones, your sons, not having knowledge of good and evil. Okay? So think of the picture that draws for you. Little ones, young children maybe, have no knowledge of good and evil. Your sons have no knowledge of good and evil. When Adam and Eve were created, they were both naked and not ashamed. What comes into the world naked? A baby. You see how picturesque the Bible is? It's drawing metaphor from everyday life. Adam and Eve's nakedness in the garden shows their childishness, their immaturity. And here we are told that young sons, young ones and sons have no knowledge of good and evil. Now let's look at 1 Kings chapter 3. And verse 9, Solomon is David's son who succeeds his throne, okay? And Solomon is having a correspondence with God. Solomon said, O God, you have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart towards you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. Now, Yahweh, my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father. But I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or how to come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? God is blessing Solomon, and he says, ask of me anything, I will give it to you. And Solomon asks, give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people. Yeah. Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. Okay? So let's read between the lines. Paraphrase that in a different way. What is Solomon asking for? Okay, we're going to get back to that when we get to Genesis again. But notice what he describes himself as. He describes himself as a child who has no idea how to go out or come in. He needs to be led around by the hand. Solomon's about 40 years old, but he's calling himself a child. And so he needs something to rule as a king. Are you putting the pieces together? This is why we need to read the Bible as a whole and associate concepts and theological principles that happen in other books when we see them in the beginning. Okay, so let's go back now to Genesis chapter 3. Okay, in Genesis chapter 3, the parents, Adam and Eve, are tempted by the enemy who comes in. So that's an aspect of guarding the temple, right? Here's a first test besides the tree. Now you have a stranger coming in to your arena. The serpent said to the woman, indeed, has God said, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden? The woman said to the serpent, from the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die. The serpent said, you will not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave to her husband with her, and he ate. The last time we looked at the beginning of chapter 2, we noticed that when God placed Adam into the garden, he placed him into a place where God had caused to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food. Okay? Catch this stuff. Genesis chapter 1, what do we see God doing? We see God assessing what is good with his sight. Okay, we have this language that trees are are pleasing to the sight and good for food. Sight and good. Sight and good. The Bible tells us already that it's true. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is good for food and it's pleasing to the eye. Eve does not make any false conclusions here in the text. Okay? The woman saw that the tree was good. All of this stuff is similar here. She's already like God. In fact, she's acting like God right now because she's judging. She's assessing. She's determining what the serpent is saying and what she knows by what Adam told her, because she wasn't there originally when God told Adam not to eat from the tree. Okay, the tree is good for food. It's a delight to the eyes. Now, notice what happens here. What is meant by the knowledge of good and evil? Right here in the text, the Bible tells us what the knowledge of good and evil means. You ready? Hopefully this will blow you away if you've never thought about this before. The woman saw that the tree was desirable to make one wise. To make one wise. Wisdom is equivalent to knowing good and evil. Wisdom is equivalent to knowing good and evil. The serpent said, God knows that when you eat of this tree, you will be like him, knowing good and evil. What does that presuppose about God? God knows about good and evil. God is able to judge between that which is good, that which is not, that which is partially good with that which is partially not good. It's assessment. It's judgment. Already, because Adam and Eve are created in God's image, they are already like God. They have the ability to judge what is good and what is not good. And that's what they had to do when God set before them the prohibition, right? When, say on day one, after the prohibition, Adam is standing and looking at the tree and saying, what's the difference between these two trees? They both look the same. It's a Golden Delicious and it's a Granny Smith. Golden Delicious and a Granny Smith. They're both apples, but God said I can't eat from that one. So he's processing, he's discerning, he's assessing. So let's put in place of the knowledge of good and evil the word wisdom. You shall not eat from the tree of wisdom. Okay, think about that. Let that set in. Why? What does that mean? I want to suggest to you that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in its prohibition, performs a tutelage, performs a schooling of sorts. The garden is a kindergarten. It is a place where children grow up to be like their parents. Okay? I think that's enough to chew on for right now. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a good thing. It's prohibited. It's a tree of wisdom. And I believe that that implies then, as Adam and Eve grow in wisdom, there will be a point at which God says, okay, you're ready to eat from this tree now because you have obeyed me up to this point. So, a lot of stuff. Hopefully that was a paradigm shift for you. Hopefully that was something that brought into you another understanding from the text. And that would be great to hear from you. And my name's Travis. This is For the Glory of God and Kings, reading the Bible for the first time again.